The desert stretched endlessly under the twin suns of Arcanus IV, its golden dunes shimmering like waves on a burning sea. Commander Eric Vale's head throbbed as he stumbled out of the wreckage of his spacecraft. Smoke billowed from the ruined engine, and sparks crackled ominously. But Eric ignored the chaos behind him. His survival instincts kicked in. This place was uncharted and dangerous. Staying near the wreckage was not an option. Eric surveyed the barren landscape. Nothing but sand and jagged rocks. The heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. He tightened his grip on his survival kit, his military training whispering reminders to stay calm and prioritize. But before he could take another step, he froze. Something, or someone, was lying half-buried in the sand not far from the crash site. Cautiously, Eric approached the figure. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't human. The body was slender, almost unnaturally so, with crystalline skin that shimmered faintly under the harsh sunlight. Her features were delicate, almost otherworldly, with silvery hair fanned out around her. It was a Xyrillus, an alien species humanity was at war with. Eric hesitated. He had fought Xyrillus ships before, their technology far superior to Earth's, their tactics ruthless. This one, however, looked different, vulnerable. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts, and her breaths came shallow and ragged. Her armor, or what remained of it, was in tatters, leaving her almost exposed to the elements. "Great," Eric muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He debated leaving her. She was the enemy, after all. But something about the sight of her stirred an uncomfortable pang in his chest. Abandoning her didn't sit right with him. A soldier's code meant nothing if it didn't include basic decency. Against his better judgment, Eric knelt beside her. "Can you hear me?" he asked gruffly. There was no response. He checked her pulse. Weak but steady, her crystalline skin was cold to the touch, an eerie contrast to the desert heat. "Figures," Eric muttered, pulling out a water canteen from his kit. He poured a few drops on her lips, hoping it would help. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, her glowing blue eyes met his. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper in a language he didn't understand. "It's okay," Eric said, though he doubted she understood him. "You're gonna be fine." The sound of distant rumbling drew his attention. A sandstorm was forming on the horizon, its massive wall of wind and dust speeding toward them. Eric cursed under his breath. They needed to move, and fast. He glanced at the alien princess, her fragile body completely incapable of fending for itself. "Guess you're coming with me," he muttered, scooping her up carefully. She was surprisingly light, her frame as delicate as glass. As the storm roared closer, Eric trudged forward into the unknown, carrying the enemy who might one day decide to kill him or save him. For now, survival was all that mattered. The sandstorm hit harder and faster than Eric had anticipated. The roaring winds screamed around him, hurling grains of sand like tiny daggers against his skin. He squinted against the biting onslaught, holding the alien woman close to his chest. She was unconscious again, her fragile body limp in his arms. Every instinct in Eric's body screamed for him to stop and find shelter, but the storm showed no mercy. "Great idea, Eric," he muttered to himself, trudging forward blindly. Rescue the enemy princess and walk into hell. The desert seemed endless, with no sign of refuge. Eric's boots sank into the shifting sands, each step a struggle as the wind fought to knock him down. His breathing grew labored, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. Stopping meant death, for him and for her. After what felt like an eternity, Eric's eyes caught a faint silhouette in the distance. A jagged outcrop of rock jutted out from the sand, forming a small natural shelter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With the last of his strength, Eric stumbled toward the rocks and collapsed behind them, shielded from the worst of the storm. He laid the alien woman down gently, his hands trembling from exhaustion. His heart pounded in his chest, and his throat felt like sandpaper. The heat of the desert was unbearable, even in the shade of the rocks. Eric grabbed his canteen and took a sip of water, resisting the urge to gulp it all down. Survival wasn't just about fighting storms. It was about rationing every resource. He glanced at the woman lying beside him. Her skin, still faintly glowing, looked pale and cracked, like fragile glass. She wouldn't last long without water. With a resigned sigh, Eric tipped the canteen to her lips, letting a few precious drops trickle down. Her eyelids fluttered again, and her glowing blue eyes opened briefly. This time, she seemed to register his presence, her gaze locking onto his. "Easy," Eric said softly. "You're safe. For now." The alien's lips moved, but her words were faint and incomprehensible. Frustrated, Eric shook his head. "I don't understand you," he said, gesturing helplessly. She winced, her hand trembling as it reached toward him. Her fingers brushed his temple, and suddenly, Eric felt a strange warmth spreading through his mind. "Human," her voice echoed in his thoughts, clear and melodic. "Why? Help me." Eric blinked, startled. It wasn't just her words. He could feel her emotions. Fear, confusion, and gratitude. He hesitated before answering, his voice gruff. "Because leaving you, there would have made me no better than the ones who abandoned you." Her eyes softened, and a faint glow flickered across her crystalline skin. Before Eric could say more, her hand fell back, and she slipped into unconsciousness again. Eric leaned back against the rock, his mind racing. What had he just gotten himself into? Whatever her story was, it was far from over, and he was right in the middle of it. As the storm raged on, Eric tightened his grip on his weapon and kept watch, knowing danger was never far behind. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the desert eerily silent. The sand dunes had shifted, transforming the landscape into something unfamiliar. Eric stirred awake, his muscles stiff from the previous day's ordeal. Beside him, the alien princess lay still, her faint glow dimmed but present. She was alive, but barely. Eric pulled himself to his feet, scanning the horizon. He needed to find water, and fast. The canteen was nearly empty, and he doubted either of them could survive much longer without it. The alien had mentioned something about an oasis before slipping back into unconsciousness. He wasn't sure if it was real or just a delirious memory, but it was his only lead. "All right, princess," Eric said, kneeling beside her. "Let's see if you've got any more surprises for me." He gently lifted her, cradling her light frame against his chest. The desert was still merciless, the heat beating down on him as he trudged forward. His instincts, honed from years of military survival training, guided him as he looked for signs of water, vegetation, cooler air, or even distant animal tracks. The alien woman occasionally stirred, mumbling words in her native language, but she didn't wake. After hours of walking, Eric spotted a faint glimmer on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, his dehydrated mind playing tricks on him. But as he drew closer, the glimmer solidified into a cluster of green. Palm trees, water, an oasis, he muttered in disbelief. For the first time in days, hope flickered in his chest. Eric quickened his pace, his legs aching, but his determination pushing him forward. As he reached the edge of the oasis, he dropped to his knees by the water's edge. The cool, crystal-clear water shimmered invitingly. Eric splashed some on his face, the relief immediate. He filled the canteen and drank deeply before turning his attention to the alien princess. "All right, your turn," he said, tilting the canteen to her lips. She drank weakly, her throat moving as she swallowed. Her glowing blue eyes fluttered open again, more focused this time. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You saved me again," her voice echoed faintly in his mind, though she still looked fragile and unsure. "Yeah, well, I wasn't about to let you die out here," Eric replied gruffly, avoiding her gaze. "Not after dragging you across half this desert." Her lips curved slightly, almost a smile, but then her expression grew serious. She sat up weakly, her crystalline skin catching the sunlight. "This place, Not safe. Eric's brow furrowed. What do you mean? It's just an oasis. Doomstalkers, she whispered, her voice trembling. They guard water. As if on cue, the ground beneath them shifted. A low growl rumbled through the air, and Eric's stomach sank. From the sands around the oasis, large, six-legged creatures began to emerge, their scales blending perfectly with the desert. Eric reached for his weapon, adrenaline surging through his veins. Of course, it couldn't just be easy, he muttered. The fight for survival had only just begun. The Doomstalkers were like nothing Eric had ever seen. Their massive bodies, built for speed, shimmered with scales that reflected the desert's harsh light. They were six-legged, with long, razor-sharp claws that scraped against the sand as they advanced. Their faces were masked by jagged, horn-like structures, and their eyes gleamed like fiery embers, locked onto Eric and the alien princess. Eric's hand went to his weapon instinctively, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These creatures were built for the desert, masters of its unforgiving terrain. He could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of the hunt. They were closing in fast, their movements almost too smooth, too silent. "Stay back," Eric whispered urgently to the princess, his voice low but firm. He could barely hear her breath, shallow and weak, her body still recovering from her injuries. Lythra, her glowing blue eyes wide with fear, nodded. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. She wasn't able to defend herself, and she trusted him to protect her. Eric glanced around, trying to formulate a plan. There were no trees, no rocks to hide behind, just the water and the shifting sand. It was a trap, and they were the prey. The first Doomstalker lunged, its claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Eric barely dodged in time, rolling to the side and coming up in a crouch. He fired a few shots from his blaster, but the creature was too fast. The energy blasts missed, striking only the sand. "Damn it," Eric muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed more time. He needed to think. "Lythra," he called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Can you do anything?" The princess struggled to her knees, her delicate hands shaking. She lifted her head, her eyes glowing brighter, focusing on the approaching creatures. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, her hand shot out, and the sand beneath the Doomstalkers shifted violently. The creatures recoiled in confusion, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They were relentless, driven by hunger and rage. One of them let out a guttural growl, circling behind Eric, while the others moved to flank him. The princess wasn't strong enough to fight them off, but her powers had slowed them down, just enough. Eric took the chance. He lunged toward the nearest creature, using his blaster to fire point blank. The shot struck its side, sending it screeching into the sand. It thrashed violently, but it was done. One down, but there were still more. He turned, aiming for another. This time, he fired multiple shots, striking it in the head. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. It lunged at him with a terrifying speed, and Eric barely managed to dodge in time. His body collided with the sand, sending a jolt of pain through his side. Lythra's eyes flared with a brilliant blue light as she reached out again. The Doomstalker nearest Eric froze mid-attack, its body suddenly rigid as though caught in an invisible net. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Eric didn't waste the moment. He grabbed his weapon and fired once more, the blast sending the creature into a convulsing heap. The remaining Doomstalkers hesitated for a moment, sensing their comrades' defeat. But they were not ready to retreat. They were desperate, and desperate creatures were the most dangerous. "We're not done yet," Eric muttered, pulling Lythra to her feet. There was no time to rest. They had to get out of there. With the stalkers closing in, Eric knew one thing. They had to leave the oasis. Fast. Eric's heart pounded as the last Doomstalker fell into the sand, its body twitching in the aftermath of Lythra's psychic strike. He didn't waste a second. The remaining creatures, 3 of them had already circled back, ready to attack again. There was no more time to fight. "Come on," Eric urged, grabbing Lithra's arm and pulling her toward the edge of the oasis. "We have to move." Lithra was weak, still recovering from her injuries, but her powers seemed to be getting stronger. Her glowing eyes flickered, and she shot a look at Eric, one filled with urgency and fear. But she didn't argue. She stumbled beside him, her bare feet pressing against the hot sand as they both sprinted toward the distant dunes. Behind them, the growls of the dune stalkers grew louder, their voices filled with rage and hunger. They were close, but Eric didn't dare look back. He couldn't. The moment he hesitated, it would be over. As they ran, the wind kicked up, making it harder to see. The storm had passed, but the desert was still a relentless beast, always shifting, always changing. Every step Eric took felt like it took him deeper into a world of endless chaos. "Keep going," Eric shouted again, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles burned, and his breath came in sharp gasps. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. Lithra's breath came just as ragged as his, but her speed had increased. Her face was pale, her skin barely holding together, but there was a fire in her eyes now. A determination. She was still alive because of him, and he wasn't about to let her down. The sand beneath their feet shifted suddenly, as if the desert itself was fighting against them. The ground seemed to ripple, making every step feel like a struggle. The dune stalkers were relentless. Their glowing eyes pierced through the sandstorm's haze, and their claws clicked against the sand, closing in on them with terrifying precision. Eric's hand tightened around his weapon, but he knew it wouldn't be enough for long. He had to find a way to lose them, to get to higher ground where he could turn and fight back if he needed to. But where? There was nothing for miles, just endless sand. Then, through the haze, Eric saw it. A rocky outcrop, jagged and high, rising from the sand. It was their only chance. "Up there," he barked, pointing toward the rocks. "Move, now." They turned toward the rocky outcrop, pushing themselves harder than ever. The dune stalkers were faster, but their larger bodies made them less agile in the loose sand. The creatures hesitated for a moment, then charged forward in full pursuit. Eric's feet sank deeper into the sand with every step, but he forced himself to move. He could see the rocks now, just ahead. They weren't far. If they could get there, they might be able to hold the creatures off, at least for a little while. With a final burst of energy, Eric reached the rocks first. He scrambled up, pulling Lithra after him. She was weaker than he was, but her determination drove her forward, and together, they made it to the top of the outcrop. They paused, catching their breath as they looked down at the dune stalkers. The creatures stopped at the base of the rocks, snarling up at them. They were relentless, but they couldn't climb. Eric wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at Lithra. "We made it, for now." But their relief was short-lived. The dune stalkers were still circling below, waiting for the right moment. The chase wasn't over yet. The rocky outcrop provided them with some temporary safety, but Eric knew it wouldn't last. The dune stalkers were still pacing below, their eerie growls filling the air, as they searched for a way to climb the rocks. Eric's hand rested on his blaster, though he knew it was no match for these creatures in close combat. "We're safe for now, but not for long," Eric muttered, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The sand stretched endlessly in every direction, no shelter in sight. Lithra sat down beside him, her delicate body trembling. She had been through so much already, and Eric could see the toll it had taken on her. Her pale, crystalline skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, but her exhaustion was clear. She closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Lithra's voice echoed softly in his mind, breaking the silence. "Why help me? I'm your enemy." Eric turned to face her, surprised by the question. She had been quiet for so long, her thoughts drifting in and out. But now, there was a sincerity in her voice that he hadn't expected. He sighed and leaned back against the rock, trying to collect his thoughts. The weight of the question pressed on him more than he realized. Why had he helped her? At first, it had just been instinct, a reflex to save a life, even if it was the life of an enemy. But now, as he sat beside her, with the doomed stalkers below, he knew there was more to it. Because, Eric began, his voice rough, because I couldn't just leave you to die out there. No matter who you are, or where you come from, everyone deserves a chance. Lithra's eyes softened, and for the first time since their meeting, she truly looked at him. Not as an enemy, but as someone who had saved her life. I was betrayed, she whispered, her voice trembling. By my own people. The Zyrilists saw me as a threat. A weakness. Eric frowned, leaning in a little closer. What happened? Why would they do that? Lithra's gaze fell to the ground, her face filled with sorrow. She took a deep breath, as though gathering strength to tell her story. I am the daughter of the Zyreless monarch. I was raised to rule, to lead my people. But I believed in peace. I wanted to stop the war with humanity. I believed we could coexist. Eric's brow furrowed. He had heard rumors of the Zyreless royal family, and their strict, war-hungry ways, but hearing it from her was different. The Zyreless, who were known for their ruthless tactics, were a mystery to him. I tried to stop the war. Lithra continued, her voice breaking. But my father, my people, they saw my peace talks as a betrayal. They saw my refusal to follow their plans as weakness. So they left me to die here. Abandoned. Alone. Eric's heart tightened as he listened to her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of betrayal that she carried. He had never imagined the Zyrellis were capable of such cruelty, but now he understood. They left me because I wasn't like them, she said softly. I believed that we could be better, that we didn't have to fight. And they didn't want that. Eric's anger simmered beneath the surface. The Zyrellis had cast aside their own princess, their own hope for peace, simply because she refused to be a part of their endless war. Sounds like your people made a mistake, he said quietly. Lithra's eyes met his, and for a moment, she didn't speak. There was a deep, unspoken understanding between them. Despite everything, despite their differences, they both knew what it felt like to be abandoned. To be alone in the desert with no one to trust. The Zyrellis will come for me, Lithra said, her voice filled with a strange determination. But I will not go back to them. Not like this. I can't. I won't. Eric's gaze softened. He had no idea what the future held for them, whether they could survive the desert, whether the Zyrellis would hunt them down. But for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to stop the war. Together. We'll figure this out, Eric said, his voice steady. We'll find a way. But first, we need to survive. And we will. As the stars began to appear above them, the desert grew quiet. For a moment, there was peace. Just the two of them, sitting beneath the vast sky. In this endless desert, they had found something rare, a fragile bond. The night was silent except for the soft rustle of the wind against the sand. The doomed stalkers had finally retreated, sensing that they had no way to reach the two humans perched high on the rocky outcrop. Eric let out a long breath, the tension of the past few hours slowly easing from his muscles. They had bought themselves some time, but time was a luxury they didn't have much of. Lithra was still beside him, her face illuminated by the pale light of the moons above. The princess's condition hadn't improved much, but she was no longer as pale as she had been earlier. Her energy, though faint, seemed to be returning slowly. We need to move, Eric said softly, his voice almost a whisper. The longer we stay here, the more likely they'll come back, and they're not going to stop hunting us. Lithra nodded, her silvery hair glinting in the moonlight. She didn't speak at first, her gaze lost in the vast desert. She had been quiet ever since revealing her painful past, but there was something different about her now. She wasn't the broken, abandoned princess anymore. There was fire in her eyes, a determination to survive. "I know of a place," Lithra finally spoke, her voice steady despite her obvious weakness. "An old ruin. My people once called it a sanctuary. It might be the only place where we can find shelter from the desert and the Zyrillus." Eric looked at her, skeptical but willing to listen. "A ruin? In this desert?" Lithra nodded, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Yes, it's hidden from view, covered by the sands for centuries. It's not far from here. If we hurry, we might reach it before the dune stalkers find us again." Eric weighed her words carefully. They had little choice. The ruins could be a trap, but they needed a safe place. The desert was a brutal enemy, and without shelter, they wouldn't last much longer. "Lead the way," he said, his voice resolute. Lithra slowly stood up, taking a moment to steady herself. Her legs were weak, but she managed to keep her balance as she began to move forward, guiding Eric through the desert. The journey was long, and the sand underfoot was soft, making every step a struggle. They moved in silence, save for the occasional sound of Lithra's soft voice guiding Eric toward the ruins. She didn't seem to be bothered by the heat or the harsh desert winds that blew the sand in their faces. Eric, on the other hand, had to wipe his brow repeatedly, his energy draining as they moved. After what felt like hours, the air began to feel cooler, and the land beneath them started to shift. The endless dunes were replaced by rocky terrain, and ahead, in the distance, Eric could make out the silhouette of ancient stone structures half buried in the sand. "There," Lithra said, her voice filled with quiet relief. "We've made it." They hurried toward the ruins, the excitement in Lithra's voice pushing Eric to move faster. As they drew closer, the outline of a large stone archway became clearer, covered in moss and sand, with carvings from a forgotten age decorating its surface. It was a strange sight, ancient, yet somehow untouched by time. Lithra stepped into the shadow of the archway, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "This was once a place of peace," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "A gathering place for those who sought refuge. But even the Zyrillus abandoned it long ago." Eric glanced around, his instincts telling him to be cautious. But there was no time to waste. They needed shelter, and the ruins seemed like their only hope. He followed Lithra into the darkness of the ancient structure, the cool air a welcome relief from the desert heat. Inside, the stone walls were surprisingly intact, and the remnants of old furniture and strange artifacts lined the dusty floors. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a temporary respite. Lithra sank to the ground, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. "We're safe here, for now," she said softly. Eric stood by the entrance, his eyes scanning the desert horizon. The night was quiet, but the stillness felt unsettling. They had a moment of peace, but Eric knew it wouldn't last. The Zyrillus would be searching for her, and the dune stalkers would never give up. Still, for the first time since the crash, Eric allowed himself to breathe a little easier. They had made it this far, and as long as they had each other, they might just survive whatever came next. "You said." The ruins were a welcome relief, offering a moment of peace that Eric hadn't felt since the crash. Inside the ancient stone structure, the cool air and relative quiet allowed them both to catch their breath. Lithra, though weak, had regained some strength, but it was clear that the toll of their journey was heavy on her. Eric glanced around the dimly lit room. The ancient walls, covered with strange symbols and carvings, seemed to hold the weight of forgotten histories. The place was abandoned, but somehow it still felt alive, like it remembered its past purpose. It was a sanctuary, once used by those seeking shelter from the harshness of the world outside. And now it had become their refuge. But the safety was temporary. Eric's instincts told him that nothing would stay quiet for long. The Zyrillus were after them, and the dune stalkers were still out there. They were far from out of danger. Lithra sat cross-legged on the stone floor, her eyes closed, her breathing slow but steady. She seemed to be gathering her strength, though her body was still frail. Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for her. He had dragged her through the desert, fought to keep her alive. And now it seemed like they were both trapped in this ancient ruin, hiding from an uncertain future. "We need to make a plan," Eric said, breaking the silence. Lithra opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. "We do," she agreed, her voice surprisingly strong. "But we can't stay here forever. The Xyrillus will find us, and the Dune Stalkers are still a threat." Eric nodded, his mind racing. "We need to find a way to get off this planet. If we can reach the Xyrillus ship, I might be able to send a distress signal to Earth. We could get help." Lithra's expression darkened. "The Xyrillus will never let us leave. They will stop at nothing to capture me and bring me back to answer for my defection." Eric ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He hadn't thought this through. Getting to the ship wasn't going to be easy, especially if the Xyrillus were actively hunting them. But they couldn't stay in the ruins forever. "We'll need to fight our way out," Eric said, his voice low and steady. "If we want to survive, we'll need to make it to their ship before they catch up to us." Lithra looked at him, her blue eyes filled with uncertainty. "You don't understand. The Xyrillus are not like humans. They will not hesitate to destroy us." Eric stood up, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had faced danger countless times before, but this felt different. This was a fight not just for survival, but for something much bigger, a chance to change the fate of two worlds. "I don't care if they're different," Eric said, determination in his voice. "We're not going to die out here. Not like this." Lithra didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked away, her gaze distant, as though torn between the hope Eric was offering and the harsh reality she had known all her life. Finally, she spoke. "Then we must act quickly. I will help you, but you must promise me one thing." Eric turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What's that?" "You will not let me fall back into their hands. If it comes down to it, I will not allow them to capture me alive." Eric's heart clenched at her words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of being forced to return to the very people who had abandoned her. It was a fear that echoed in his own chest, the fear of losing her. "I promise," he said, his voice firm. "We'll make it out of this together." Lithra nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. It was small, but it was there, proof that she still had some hope left, even after everything she had been through. "Let's go then," she said, rising to her feet. "We have a long road ahead of us." Eric nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. He had no idea what awaited them outside the ruins, but he was ready. They had a chance now, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Together, they stepped out into the desert once more, ready for whatever trials lay ahead. The final trial had just begun. The sun was high as Eric and Lithra made their way out of the ruins. The desert stretched before them, its vast emptiness both a curse and a blessing. They had no choice but to push forward. The Xyrillus were close, and the only chance of escape was to reach their ship. But each step felt heavier than the last, and the thought of what they were up against gnawed at Eric's mind. Lithra, despite her frailty, moved with a quiet determination. Her crystal-like skin shimmered under the harsh sun, but there was no time to appreciate its beauty. They had to stay ahead of the Xyrillus before they were hunted down. "We're getting close," Lithra whispered, her voice strained. She had said that before, but this time, something in her tone made Eric believe her. The fear and doubt that had once clouded her eyes had faded, replaced with a cold resolve. Eric nodded. "Just a little further," he said, his voice low but firm. He kept glancing over his shoulder, watching for any signs of movement, knowing that the danger could strike at any moment. As they trudged across the desert, a sudden sound shattered the stillness. An engine, faint but unmistakable. Eric's heart skipped a beat. A ship. The Xyrillus had found them. They were too late. We have to move faster, Eric said, grabbing Lithra's arm and pulling her into a nearby ravine. The wind whipped around them, the sand blurring their vision as they ducked behind a rock formation. From their hiding spot, they saw the silhouette of a Zyrilless ship descending toward the desert. It was sleek, with sharp edges that glinted in the sunlight, a vessel that reflected the power and authority of the Zyrilless. "They're here," Lithra muttered, her voice trembling. "I knew they would come." Eric held her gaze, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do next. They were cornered, trapped in a vast desert with no way out. But then, as the ship touched down, something unexpected happened. The hatch opened and a figure emerged, Lithra's sister, the one who had betrayed her. "Lizara." Lithra's voice was barely a whisper, filled with a mix of disbelief and pain. Eric's grip tightened on his blaster, instinctively moving in front of Lithra, shielding her. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't trust Lizara. He couldn't. Lizara's eyes locked onto Lithra, her expression cold and unforgiving. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you?" she sneered, her voice cutting through the air. "You're nothing but a traitor, a weakness to our people." Lithra's face hardened, the hurt in her eyes replaced by defiance. "I am not your puppet, Lizara. I will never follow your path of destruction. I wanted peace, and I still do." Lizara stepped forward, her hand reaching for a weapon at her side. "Your peace is a lie," she spat. "The Zyrilless will never bow to peace. You are a threat to everything we've worked for." Eric's finger hovered over the trigger, but he hesitated. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was personal. It was a family torn apart by power, by fear. He knew that if Lithra couldn't change her sister's heart, no one could. "I'm not your enemy, Lizara," Lithra said, her voice steady despite the pain. "But I will not return with you. I will not be a part of your war." The two sisters stood locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down. Eric could feel the tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. But he also saw something else, a crack in Lizara's facade, a hint of uncertainty. The Zyrilless were a proud people, but even they had weaknesses. "You've made your choice," Lizara finally said, her eyes narrowing. "But don't think this is over." With that, she turned and stormed back toward the ship, her soldiers following closely behind. Lithra slumped against the rock, her body shaking. "I thought she would understand. I thought maybe I could save her." Eric walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You tried," he said softly. "You did everything you could." Lithra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and relief. "And now, what do we do?" Eric looked out at the desert, the Zyrilless ship already rising into the sky, leaving them behind. He wasn't sure of the answer, but one thing was certain: they had a chance. They had made it this far, and as long as they had each other, there was still hope. "We keep moving," he said, his voice steady. "We fight for the future, and we survive." Lithra nodded, a new determination burning in her eyes. Together, they would face whatever came next. The war wasn't over, but their fight had just begun. The desert stretched before them, its vastness both overwhelming and oddly comforting. The fight with Lithra's sister had left them with more questions than answers, but the resolve in Eric's heart was stronger than ever. The Zyrilless had shown their cruelty, but they hadn't broken him or Lithra. If anything, their defiance had only pushed them further. The path ahead was still unclear, but together they had a chance. Eric looked at Lithra as she stood beside him, her silvery hair tousled by the wind, her face set with quiet determination. Her crystalline skin still shimmered faintly, but there was a strength in her eyes now, a strength that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just a princess or a victim. She was a leader, someone who had the courage to fight for peace, even when her own people had abandoned her for it. "We can't just hide forever," Eric said, his voice steady. "We need to find a way to reach humanity, to warn them, The Xyrilus won't stop until they've taken everything from us. Lythra nodded, her expression thoughtful. I know, but I'm not sure we can trust the Xyrilus or humanity anymore. Both sides are at war, and peace feels impossible. Eric sighed, looking out over the endless expanse of sand. The desert felt like it was closing in on them, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The war between humanity and the Xyrilus had been brutal, and there was no end in sight. Peace seemed like a distant dream, something too fragile to hold on to. But still, he had to believe that there was hope. He had to believe that there was more to fight for than just survival. We don't have to fix everything at once, Eric said, glancing at her. But we can make a start. We can find allies. We can build something better. Together. Lythra looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You still believe in that? In peace? After everything? Eric's gaze was steady as he nodded. I do. I've seen too much destruction, too much loss. I'm done being a part of it. If you're willing to fight for peace, then I will be by your side. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Lythra's lips. She was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. You're not the only one who believes in peace. The Xyrilus, my people, they're not all the same. There are those who want what I want. I can still reach them. I can still try. Eric reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then let's go, he said with determination. Let's find a way, no matter what it takes. Together, they turned toward the horizon, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting the desert in golden light. They had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in days, they had hope. Hope that the future could be different. Hope that there could be peace, even in the most unlikely places. As they walked forward, side by side, the wind carried the sound of their footsteps across the desert. It was a beginning, a new chapter in a story that was far from over. They had survived against all odds, and now, together, they would fight for something worth living for.